The moment an HOA security guard handed me an eviction notice on my own land, I knew somebody was about to learn a very expensive lesson about property rights. The smell of hot asphalt hit me before I even stepped out of my truck. It hung in the August air like a thick gray curtain, mixing with diesel fumes from construction equipment and the dry scent of Texas cedar. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the temporary gate that now blocked the dirt road my grandfather had driven for nearly 50 years. Beyond that gate stood 68 brand-new homes. Fresh roofs, fresh paint, fresh sod, an entire neighborhood where my family's pasture used to be. A man in a bright yellow safety vest spotted me approaching and immediately reached for a clipboard. His posture stiffened. His eyes narrowed. Then he pulled a folded document from a manila envelope and extended it toward me. "Sir, you've been formally notified that you're trespassing on Cedar Creek Estates property." I looked down at the paper. My name was printed across the top in bold letters. The document demanded that I vacate the premises immediately and warned that future violations would result in legal action. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt amazed. Amazed at the level of confidence required to hand an eviction notice to the actual owner of the land. I slowly raised my eyes toward the rows of finished houses stretching across the horizon. White fences, black mailboxes, decorative stone entrances. Families were already moving in. Minivans lined the streets. Kids rode bicycles along sidewalks that hadn't even been completed 2 weeks earlier. Somebody had invested millions of dollars into this development. Somebody had sold dozens of homes. Somebody had approved every permit, every survey, every blueprint. And somehow nobody had bothered to verify who owned the ground underneath it all. The distant hum of an excavator echoed across the property. A nail gun popped somewhere near the back lots. The neighborhood looked polished, expensive, permanent. That's what made the situation almost unbelievable. "You understand this land belongs to Cedar Creek Estates now, right?" the guard asked. His voice carried the kind of certainty people get when they're repeating something they've heard 100 times. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked past him toward a lonely oak tree standing near the center of the development. The tree looked completely out of place among the brand-new houses. Massive branches stretched across the sky. Thick roots disappeared into the ground beneath carefully installed landscaping. Every other tree on the property had been removed during construction. That one remained. For some reason, nobody had touched it. A small smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. "You sure about that?" I asked. The guard frowned. "Sir." I folded the notice and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking." The truth was that I had spent the last 3 months watching this entire disaster unfold. Watching survey crews hammer stakes into the ground. Watching bulldozers reshape fields I knew better than the back of my own hand. Watching concrete trucks pour foundations where cattle once grazed. Every time I drove past, the development grew larger. Every week brought another row of houses. Another paved street. Another layer of investment. Most people would have tried to stop it immediately. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have marched into court the moment the first shovel hit the dirt. I didn't. I waited. And as strange as it sounds, I waited on purpose. The wind shifted and carried the smell of fresh-cut lumber across the property. Somewhere nearby, a moving truck door slammed shut. A young couple unloaded boxes into one of the finished homes while a realtor smiled for photographs. They looked happy, excited, proud. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Because none of them knew what I knew. None of them knew about the original property records. None of them knew about the documents my grandfather left behind. None of them knew why that old oak tree still stood untouched in the middle of their subdivision. Most importantly, none of them knew that the biggest surprise wasn't waiting in a field or hidden in a barn. It was waiting inside a courtroom. I took one last look across the 68 homes built on land everyone believed belonged to the HOA. Then I turned around and walked back toward my truck. The gravel crackled beneath my boots. Behind me, the construction noise continued as if nothing was wrong. As if everything was perfectly normal. As if an entire neighborhood hadn't just been built on the wrong piece of Texas soil. That oak tree had been standing there longer than anyone in Cedar Creek Estates had been alive. Longer than the county records office. Longer than most of the roads connecting our town to the rest of Texas. My grandfather used to say that if you wanted to understand who really owned a piece of land, you stopped looking at paper for a minute and looked at what had survived. I learned that lesson when I was 8 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of his old Ford pickup while the air smelled like dust, motor oil, and summer grass. His hands were rough from decades of ranch work. His voice was calm. He pointed toward that same oak tree and said, "Ethan, if anybody ever tells you this land belongs to somebody else, start there." At the time, I thought he was talking about memories. Years later, I realized he was talking about something much more important. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought the property in 1948 after returning home from military service. Back then the land was nothing but rolling pasture, cedar groves, and open sky. No subdivisions. No homeowners associations. No decorative stone entrances with fancy names carved into them. Just hard ground and opportunity. He spent decades building a life there. He raised cattle, fixed fences, dug ponds. Every inch of the property carried a story. The old barn where he taught me how to replace a broken hinge. The creek where I caught my first base. The ridge overlooking the western pasture where we watched thunderstorms roll across the horizon. Some families passed down money. Mine passed down land. And around here, that means something. By the time I inherited responsibility for the property, I had already spent years serving as an Army engineer. Infrastructure projects became my profession. Survey maps, property boundaries, construction plans, legal easements. Most people see paperwork. I see the story underneath it. That is probably why the entire situation bothered me less than people expected. Do not get me wrong. Watching strangers build houses on family land felt like someone had painted over a piece of history. But panic never solves engineering problems. Facts do. The afternoon after receiving the eviction notice, I parked near the edge of the development and watched crews finish landscaping around one of the model homes. The smell of fresh sod mixed with fertilizer drifted through the open truck window. Workers unloaded decorative shrubs while sales agents guided prospective buyers through polished interiors. Everything looked successful. That was the frightening part. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates carelessness. Carelessness leaves evidence. A black sport utility vehicle rolled past carrying the logo of Cedar Creek Estates. Behind the wheel sat Margaret Holloway. Even from a distance, she carried herself like someone who believed the entire county revolved around her schedule. Perfect hair, designer sunglasses, a smile that never reached her eyes. She slowed briefly near the sales office while several employees hurried toward her. Nobody questioned her authority. Nobody hesitated. She had built a reputation as the woman who could make things happen. Permits appeared. Projects moved forward. Problems disappeared. At least that was the image she sold. I watched her step out of the vehicle and gesture toward the newest row of completed homes. The employees nodded immediately. One even laughed at something she said. Margaret looked pleased. Victorious, almost. The development was becoming exactly what she wanted it to be. Families moving in. Property values rising. Local newspapers publishing glowing articles about community growth. From the outside, it looked like a triumph. From where I sat, it looked like a countdown clock. The late afternoon sun reflected off dozens of newly installed windows. For a moment, the entire subdivision seemed to glow. Then my eyes drifted back toward the oak tree. The giant branches moved gently in the breeze. Quiet, unbothered, patient, just like they had been for decades. My grandfather always trusted time more than emotion. People rush, he used to tell me. Truth does not. As I sat there listening to the distant hum of lawn equipment and the occasional bark of a construction foreman, I remembered something else he had said shortly before he passed away. We had been standing beside that same tree while the evening wind rustled through the leaves overhead. He rested one hand against the trunk and smiled. One day this tree is going to save somebody a lot of trouble. At the time, neither of us knew exactly what he meant. Now, watching an entire subdivision grow around it, I was beginning to understand. Margaret Holloway did not become the most powerful person in Cedar Creek Estates by accident. She built that reputation the same way developers build subdivisions, one carefully planned layer at a time. The first time I met her was nearly 2 years before the construction started. Back then the property was still open pasture. The grass rolled across the hills like green waves beneath the Texas sun. I was repairing a section of fence near the northern boundary when a white luxury sport utility vehicle pulled onto the dirt access road. The vehicle stopped 20 yards away. The door opened. Out stepped Margaret. Even then she looked exactly like she did now. Perfect posture, Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. The smell of expensive perfume drifted through the warm afternoon air as she approached. She introduced herself as president of the Cedar Creek Homeowners Association. Friendly, polite, professional, at least on the surface. She asked questions about the land, how much acreage I owned, whether I planned to develop it, whether I had considered selling. At first the conversation felt normal. Then I noticed something. She was not admiring the property. She was evaluating it. Her eyes moved constantly. Fence lines, elevation changes, access points, road connections. She studied the land the way an investor studies a balance sheet. When I told her the property had been in my family for generations, her smile tightened for half a second. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. Before leaving, she handed me a business card. If you ever decide to sell, she said, I can make that process very easy. I thanked her and tucked the card into my pocket. 3 days later, I threw it away. Looking back, that was probably the moment she decided I had become an obstacle. Over the next year, Cedar Creek Estates expanded rapidly. New phases opened. New roads appeared. New homes sold. Margaret became something of a local celebrity. Real estate magazines featured her. Business groups invited her to speak. Local officials attended community events she organized. Everywhere she went, people seemed eager to agree with her. The strange thing was that the more successful she became, the less patient she seemed. Success had convinced her that every problem could be solved with influence. Every delay could be pushed aside. Every objection could be overcome. Then the housing market surged. Property values climbed. Developers started searching for every available acre near town. Suddenly, my family's land was no longer a quiet ranch sitting beyond the suburbs. It had become the missing piece of a much larger puzzle. One afternoon, I attended a county planning meeting out of curiosity. Margaret was there. So were several developers and local consultants. Large maps covered the walls. Proposed road expansions, utility corridors, future residential growth. I noticed something interesting. One of the maps showed Cedar Creek Estates extending directly across property that belonged to me. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Then I watched Margaret walk over and point to the exact area while discussing future plans with a developer. They spoke quietly, but their body language said everything. They were not wondering if expansion would happen. They were discussing when. That was the moment I realized she already considered the land hers. Not legally, mentally. In her mind, the outcome had already been decided. The following months brought small signs of trouble. Survey crews appeared near property boundaries. Temporary markers showed up in unusual locations. Construction vehicles occasionally crossed areas where they had no reason to be. Every time questions arose, somebody claimed it was a misunderstanding, a mapping error, a paperwork issue, an innocent mistake. Too many innocent mistakes started happening around the same piece of land. Then came the rumors. Neighbors mentioned hearing about a massive expansion project. Real estate agents talked about future inventory. Contractors discussed upcoming work schedules. Everybody seemed to know something was coming except the people who actually owned the property. Through it all, Margaret continued smiling, continued attending ribbon cuttings, continued presenting herself as the visionary leader guiding Cedar Creek Estates toward the future. Standing at the edge of the completed subdivision now, I understood something important. People like Margaret rarely see themselves as villains. They convince themselves they are builders, problem solvers, visionaries. They believe results justify shortcuts. They believe confidence equals correctness. And after enough victories, they stop asking whether they can do something and start assuming they already have permission. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rows of finished homes. In the distance, I spotted Margaret again, speaking with a group of prospective buyers outside the sales center. They listened carefully while she pointed toward the neighborhood behind her. The development looked flawless, successful, permanent. Exactly the image she wanted the world to see. What she could not see was the one thing hiding beneath all that confidence. A mistake so large that it would eventually swallow every victory she thought she had earned. Within 6 months, the transformation was almost impossible to believe. The same fields where my grandfather had once driven cattle now held paved streets with names chosen by marketing consultants. Willow Lane, Cedar View Drive, Heritage Circle. The irony of that last one nearly made me laugh every time I saw the sign. Heritage. They had built an entire neighborhood on land whose actual history they never bothered to understand. Every week, another moving truck arrived. Every week, another family unloaded furniture, bicycles, patio chairs, and carefully labeled cardboard boxes. The smell of fresh paint drifted through the subdivision almost constantly. New lawns appeared overnight. Mailboxes filled with welcome packets. Porch lights glowed across streets that had not even existed a year earlier. Cedar Creek Estates celebrated every milestone like a championship victory. The sales center hosted open houses every weekend. Local newspapers published articles praising the development's success. Real estate websites described it as one of the fastest-growing communities in the county. Margaret appeared in nearly every photograph, smiling, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, standing beside oversized presentation boards showing future expansion plans. She looked like someone who had conquered an empire. The more successful the project became, the bolder she grew. One afternoon, I stopped at a small diner near town. The kind of place where the coffee never stops flowing and everybody knows everybody's business. As I walked in, I noticed a television mounted above the counter showing a local business segment. There was Margaret again. The anchor praised her leadership while images of the neighborhood rolled across the screen. New homes, happy families, tree-lined streets. Then came a statement that nearly made me choke on my coffee. Margaret proudly announced that every acre involved in the project had been thoroughly verified and legally secured before construction began. I remember staring at the screen while the waitress refilled my mug. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the room. Forks clinked against plates. Nobody else seemed to notice the significance of what had just been said. But I did, because confidence like that only comes from one of two things: absolute certainty or absolute ignorance. The following month brought another milestone. The 68th home sold. Every lot was occupied. Every driveway contained vehicles. Children played basketball in cul-de-sacs. Dog walkers strolled along sidewalks at sunset. Holiday decorations appeared on front porches. The neighborhood had become fully alive. I drove through several times during those weeks. Not because I enjoyed it, because I needed to understand the scale of what was happening. The crunch of gravel had been replaced by the soft hum of tires rolling over fresh pavement. The open views across pasture land were now blocked by rows of rooftops. Yet one thing remained exactly where it had always been: the oak tree, standing in the middle of everything. During one drive, I noticed workers installing decorative benches nearby. They had actually turned the area around the tree into a small community park. Children climbed around the massive trunk while parents sat nearby talking. The sight struck me as strangely poetic. The one piece of the original property nobody could erase had become the centerpiece of the entire subdivision. Margaret probably viewed it as a marketing feature, a charming landmark, a touch of authentic Texas character. She had no idea it represented something far more important. Around that same time, I received another certified letter. This one came directly from Cedar Creek Estates. The envelope smelled faintly of printer toner and fresh paper when I opened it. Inside was a formal demand instructing me to cease entering certain portions of the development. According to their legal team, repeated presence on community property could create liability concerns. Liability concerns. I read that phrase 3 times before laughing out loud. They were warning me about entering land my family had owned for more than 70 years. The remarkable part was not the letter itself. It was how completely everyone involved believed their own version of reality. Surveyors, developers, attorneys, investors, homebuyers, local officials. Entire layers of professionals had accepted the same assumption without digging deeper. The project had become too large for anyone to question. Too expensive. Too successful. Success creates momentum. Momentum discourages scrutiny. And every day that passed added more momentum. By late autumn, the neighborhood hosted its first community festival. Food trucks lined the entrance road. Live music drifted through the evening air. Families gathered beneath strings of decorative lights. Margaret stood on a temporary stage, thanking residents for believing in her vision. Applause echoed across the subdivision. Looking around at the celebration, I realized something important. The mistake was no longer a construction error. It was no longer a paperwork issue. It had evolved into something much bigger. 68 families now lived inside the consequences of a decision nobody had properly verified. And the longer the celebration continued, the more devastating the eventual truth would become. Winter arrived with the kind of cold Texas mornings that make every sound seem sharper. Frost clung to fence posts before sunrise, and the air carried that clean scent of cedar and dry earth that always reminded me of my grandfather. By then, the subdivision was fully occupied. Holiday lights glowed from rooftops that should never have existed. Delivery trucks moved through streets built across land that still appeared under my family's name in places nobody had bothered to check. Every time I drove past, I felt the same strange mixture of frustration and certainty. Frustration because of how far things had gone. Certainty because I knew something they did not. The problem was that I still needed proof strong enough to survive a courtroom. Assumptions do not win property cases. Documents do. One Saturday morning, I decided to clean out the old barn near the southern pasture. The structure had survived storms, droughts, and decades of Texas weather. The metal roof creaked softly in the wind. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight cutting across the interior. The smell of aged lumber, machine oil, and old leather filled the air. Most of the contents had not been touched since my grandfather passed away. Shelves held rusted tools. Cabinets contained coffee cans filled with bolts and screws collected over half a century. Every corner carried memories. I spent hours sorting through boxes and equipment. Nothing seemed important at first. Old tax receipts, equipment manuals, feed invoices, the kind of paperwork families accumulate over generations. Then I noticed something unusual behind a stack of wooden crates near the back wall. A small steel lockbox sat beneath an old canvas tarp. The box looked familiar. I remembered seeing it once when I was a teenager. My grandfather had kept it stored in his office for years before moving it to the barn. At the time, I assumed it contained personal papers. Standing there in the dusty silence, I suddenly remembered something else. The day he moved it, he told me never to throw it away. Not because it contained valuables, because it contained answers. The memory hit me so clearly that I actually stopped moving for a moment. Outside, the wind rattled loose tin along the roofline. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I carried the box to an old workbench and brushed away decades of dust. The metal surface felt cold beneath my hands. The latch had corroded, but after a few minutes I managed to open it. Inside sat several neatly organized folders. Yellowed survey maps, property records, photographs, correspondence with county officials dating back decades. The smell of old paper rose from the box the moment I lifted the first folder. Anyone who has ever handled archived documents knows that scent. Dry, faintly sweet. A smell that somehow feels like history itself. I spent the next several hours reading everything. Most of it confirmed facts I already knew. Ownership transfers, tax records, boundary agreements with neighboring ranches. Then I reached the bottom of the box. There, protected inside a sealed document sleeve, rested something I had never seen before. An original deed package from 1948. Not a copy, not a reproduction. The original filing. Attached to it was a detailed survey map prepared by a licensed surveyor whose notes referenced multiple permanent landmarks across the property. One of those landmarks immediately caught my attention. The oak tree. My pulse quickened. I carefully unfolded the large survey sheet across the workbench. Handwritten measurements stretched across the page. Bearings, distances, coordinates. Every boundary line traced with remarkable precision considering the era. Then I saw it. A notation identifying the oak tree as a permanent legal reference marker tied directly to the property's original surveyed boundaries. I stared at that line for several seconds. Outside, the afternoon sunlight had begun fading toward evening. Shadows stretched across the barn floor. Suddenly, my grandfather's words made perfect sense. If anybody ever tells you this land belongs to somebody else, start there. He had not been talking about sentiment. He had been talking about evidence. Real evidence. Legal evidence. The kind that survives generations. The kind that cannot be replaced by marketing brochures, development plans, or confident speeches. I sat alone in the growing silence of the barn while the reality settled in. The tree standing in the middle of the subdivision was not just a surviving piece of history. It was connected directly to the documents proving exactly where the property boundaries belonged. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I realized the outcome might be even bigger than I originally imagined. Most people assume I stayed quiet because I was overwhelmed. Some assumed I could not afford lawyers. Others believed I had simply given up. Margaret certainly seemed to believe that. Every time I saw her in public, she carried the relaxed confidence of someone who thought the battle had already ended. What nobody understood was that silence and surrender are not the same thing. The week after discovering the documents in my grandfather's lockbox, I contacted 3 different professionals. Not attorneys. Not yet. Surveyors. The kind of people who spend their lives measuring reality instead of arguing about it. I wanted independent verification before I took another step. The first surveyor reviewed the documents and immediately requested copies. The second asked to visit the property in person. The third spent nearly an hour studying the original survey notes over a video call. Their reactions were remarkably similar. Long pauses, raised eyebrows, careful questions. None of them offered conclusions immediately. Real experts rarely do. But every conversation pushed me in the same direction. Something was very wrong with the development's boundary assumptions. During those weeks, I continued driving through the subdivision occasionally. I noticed new landscaping projects, decorative lighting, additional amenities. Cedar Creek Estates was still investing money. A lot of money. The smell of fresh mulch and newly planted shrubs seemed to follow every phase of construction. Contractors worked constantly. Residents upgraded patios. The Homeowners Association approved improvement projects. Everywhere I looked, more value was being added to property that rested on increasingly unstable legal ground. One evening, I parked near the edge of the development and watched the sun sink behind the rooftops. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Sprinkler systems hissed across perfectly maintained lawns. It looked peaceful, permanent, established. That was precisely why I kept waiting. The larger the investment became, the harder it would be for anyone involved to dismiss the consequences later. A rushed confrontation months earlier might have produced confusion. Now it would produce documentation, paper trails, financial records, public filings. The entire machine had continued operating under the assumption that nobody would challenge it. Every day, that assumption generated more evidence. Around that time, one of the surveyors completed his preliminary findings. We met in a small office overlooking the courthouse square. The room smelled faintly of coffee and blueprint paper. Large maps covered the walls. Property records sat stacked on metal shelves. He spread several documents across a conference table and carefully explained what he had discovered. Historical records matched my grandfather's original survey. County archives supported the same boundaries. Multiple generations of tax assessments aligned with the same legal descriptions. Most importantly, the oak tree appeared repeatedly across decades of documentation as a recognized reference point. Not symbolic. Legal. Measurable. Verifiable. I remember looking down at those records while a strange calm settled over me. Months earlier, I had suspected something was wrong. Now I knew. The development had not simply crossed a boundary line. Entire sections of it appeared positioned based on flawed assumptions. The implications were enormous. The surveyor leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. Then he asked a question I will never forget. Why did you let them keep building? I looked through the office window toward the courthouse clock tower outside. The answer seemed obvious. Because they never stopped themselves. He nodded slowly. No further explanation was necessary. The truth was that I had realized something important about Margaret months ago. She viewed hesitation as weakness. Every warning sign had been interpreted as permission. Every opportunity to slow down had been ignored. Every question had been answered with more construction, more expansion, more confidence. She believed momentum could replace certainty. It happens more often than people realize. Success convinces people they are correct. Applause convinces people they are untouchable. Eventually, they stop verifying facts because they assume facts will cooperate. As winter turned toward spring, Cedar Creek Estates prepared for another major announcement. Rumors circulated about future phases and additional development. Margaret appeared at community meetings discussing growth opportunities. Investors attended presentations. New partnerships formed. Listening to those reports felt surreal. They were already planning the next chapter, while the foundation beneath the current one remained unresolved. One afternoon, I drove past the community park built around the oak tree. Families sat on benches beneath its massive branches. Children laughed nearby. Wind moved softly through the leaves. Standing there, I placed one hand against the rough bark and remembered my grandfather's voice. Truth does not rush. Looking around the neighborhood that had grown up around that tree, I finally understood what he meant. The time for rushing had passed. The time for proving had arrived. The real breakthrough arrived on a windy Tuesday morning when the final survey package landed on my desk. I remember the sound of the delivery tube rolling across the wooden surface and stopping beside a stack of county records. Outside, spring rain tapped softly against the office windows. The smell of coffee and fresh paper filled the room. For months, I had been collecting pieces of a puzzle that stretched back more than 70 years. Now, for the first time, everything existed in one place. Historical surveys, modern satellite imaging, drone mapping, county archives, tax records, boundary descriptions, easement filings. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. The survey team had gone further than I expected. Using modern positioning equipment, they recreated the original property boundaries described in my grandfather's deed package. Then they overlaid those boundaries onto current aerial imagery of the subdivision. The results were astonishing. Colored lines crossed streets, yards, sidewalks, and common areas. Lot numbers filled the maps. Measurements appeared beside every boundary. There was no ambiguity, no guesswork, no room for interpretation. The evidence was visual, precise, and devastating. I spent hours reviewing every page. Years of engineering work had trained me to look for weaknesses, missing information, faulty assumptions, mathematical inconsistencies. I found none. The survey package was meticulous. Every conclusion connected to verifiable records. Every measurement could be reproduced independently. The oak tree sat near the center of multiple diagrams like an anchor, holding everything together. What generations had treated as a simple landmark had become the key to understanding the entire property history. That afternoon, I met with a property attorney recommended by one of the surveyors. His office overlooked the courthouse square. The walls carried framed maps and legal certificates dating back decades. He studied the documents quietly for nearly an hour. Occasionally, he adjusted his glasses or made notes in the margins. Mostly, he remained silent. When he finally looked up, the expression on his face told me everything before he spoke a single word. "This changes the conversation completely," he said. Those 5 words carried more weight than any speech Margaret had ever given. For months, the narrative had been simple. A successful development, a respected homeowners association, a property owner making inconvenient claims. The survey package transformed that narrative into something else entirely. Now there was evidence. Physical evidence. Historical evidence. Measurable evidence. The attorney recommended immediate legal action. He explained that waiting longer served no purpose. The facts were established. The records were verified. The documentation was stronger than many property disputes he had handled in his entire career. Yet before leaving his office, I asked him one question. If this goes forward, how surprised are they going to be? He leaned back slightly and glanced again at the maps spread across his desk. Then he smiled. "Based on what I am seeing here," he said, "they have absolutely no idea what is coming." Over the next several weeks, our team assembled the case. Every filing required supporting records. Every claim required documentation. The process felt less like preparing for an argument and more like constructing a bridge. Each piece had to connect perfectly to the next. Accuracy mattered. Precision mattered. Patience mattered. Meanwhile, life inside the subdivision continued as normal. Community newsletters celebrated neighborhood achievements. New landscaping projects appeared. Homeowners attended meetings and discussed future improvements. Margaret remained highly visible. Her photographs appeared in local business publications. Interviews praised her leadership. Investors discussed additional opportunities. From the outside, everything still looked flawless. That contrast became almost surreal. On one side existed public confidence. On the other existed a growing mountain of evidence. The two realities moved toward each other like trains on the same track. One evening shortly before the filing date, I returned to the community park. The sun was setting behind the rooftops. Warm light filtered through the branches of the oak tree. Children laughed nearby while parents talked on benches. Wind rustled the leaves overhead. Standing beneath those branches, I placed my hand against the rough bark again. The same bark my grandfather had touched decades earlier. The same tree described in documents older than anyone living in the neighborhood. For months, that tree had quietly watched families move in, streets appear, and assumptions harden into certainty. Now it was about to become the centerpiece of something much larger. Because the survey that rested inside my truck was not merely a collection of measurements. It was the document that connected the past to the present. the document that transformed suspicion into proof, and the document that would soon force an entire subdivision to confront a truth that had been standing in plain sight all along. The courthouse felt unusually quiet that morning. Not silent, just heavy. The kind of atmosphere that settles over a room when people know something important is about to happen, but nobody is completely sure what. The smell of polished wood and old paper lingered in the air as attorneys arranged folders across long tables. Court staff moved with practiced efficiency. Reporters filled several seats near the back. Representatives from banks, title companies, and insurance firms occupied entire rows. Even before proceedings began, it was obvious this case had grown far beyond a simple property dispute. I sat beside my attorney reviewing the final exhibits one last time. The original deed package rested inside a protective folder. The survey maps sat organized in sequence. Every document had been authenticated. Every record had been verified. Across the room, Margaret Holloway appeared remarkably calm. She wore the same confident expression I had seen for years. Her legal team occupied nearly an entire table. Stacks of binders surrounded them. They spoke quietly among themselves while occasionally glancing in my direction. From the outside, they looked prepared, powerful, certain. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The room settled into silence. Opening arguments began. Cedar Creek Estates presented its position first. Their attorneys described a successful development completed through proper channels. They discussed permits, approvals, surveys, financing, and construction records. Large screens displayed photographs of the neighborhood, streets, homes, parks, community facilities. The presentation looked impressive. Every image reinforced the same message. The project was real, established, successful. Several residents seated in the gallery nodded along. Margaret occasionally smiled. Then our turn arrived. My attorney stood slowly and approached the display screen. The first image that appeared surprised many people. It was not a survey, not a legal document, not a map. It was a photograph of the oak tree. The same tree standing in the center of the subdivision. Murmurs moved through the room. My attorney said nothing for several seconds. He simply allowed everyone to look at the image. Then he displayed a second photograph. The same tree decades earlier. Then a third. Then a fourth. Historical records. Survey references. Archived county photographs. The tree appeared again and again across generations. The room grew noticeably quieter. Next came the original deed package. Enlarged images filled the courtroom screens. Handwritten survey notes. Boundary descriptions. Official seals. Historical filings. The judge leaned forward slightly. Several attorneys began taking notes. Margaret's smile disappeared for the first time that morning. Then came the moment everything changed. My attorney displayed the modern survey overlay created by independent experts. The screen showed the subdivision from above. Streets appeared in gray. Homes appeared in blue. Property boundaries appeared in bright red. A few people shifted in their seats. Others leaned closer. The image remained on screen while the surveyor who prepared it explained his methodology. Historical records. Modern measurements. County archives. Drone mapping. Layer after layer of verification. Then he highlighted the oak tree. The reference point connected directly to the original property descriptions. The courtroom screen updated again. This time the boundaries became impossible to ignore. Red lines crossed through streets, across sidewalks, through common areas, across dozens of residential lots. The silence became absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The only sound came from the surveyor's voice as he calmly explained measurement after measurement. I looked across the room toward Margaret. The confidence was gone. She stared at the screen without blinking. Her attorneys exchanged hurried notes. One reached for a calculator. Another flipped rapidly through documents. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, they were reacting instead of controlling the narrative. The surveyor finished. Then the title expert testified. Then the records specialist. Then the county archivist. Every witness reinforced the same conclusion. Different evidence. Same destination. The original boundaries remained valid. The historical records remained intact. The oak tree remained exactly where the original survey said it would be. By late afternoon, the courtroom felt completely different from the room I had entered that morning. The assumptions that had supported years of confidence were collapsing under the weight of documentation. The development itself had not changed. The houses still stood. The streets still existed. but the story surrounding them had transformed. What began as a dispute now looked like a chain of mistakes nobody had properly examined. As the final exhibit appeared on the screen, showing the full relationship between the original property boundaries and the completed neighborhood, an audible breath moved through the gallery. The truth had finally become visible. Not hidden in archives, not buried inside legal descriptions. Visible, right there in front of everyone. And once people saw it, they could not unsee it. The ruling arrived 3 weeks later on a bright spring morning. By then the story had spread far beyond our county. Reporters waited outside the courthouse. Industry publications discussed the case. Real estate attorneys from across the state followed every update. The smell of fresh rain lingered in the air as people gathered on the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom felt calmer than before. The arguments were finished. The evidence had been presented. The facts had survived scrutiny. All that remained was the decision. When the judge began reading the findings, nobody interrupted. Every sentence seemed to land heavier than the one before it. Historical records were valid. Original surveys were recognized. Property boundaries were confirmed. Independent measurements were accepted. The documentation connected cleanly across decades. The legal ownership history remained intact. I sat quietly listening while years of assumptions unraveled line by line. Across the room, Margaret stared straight ahead. The confidence that once defined her had vanished completely. She looked exhausted, smaller somehow, not because anyone had defeated her personally, but because reality had finally caught up with certainty. The ruling did not create the truth. It simply acknowledged it. By the time the judge finished, the consequences had already begun moving through the system. Banks launched reviews. Insurance companies opened investigations. Title agencies revisited records. Attorneys representing homeowners started filing claims. Meetings filled calendars across the county. Nobody celebrated. Nobody cheered. The atmosphere felt too serious for that. Real property disputes affect real people. Families had purchased homes believing everything was secure. Many of them had no idea mistakes existed until the courtroom evidence appeared. I felt sympathy for them. They were not the ones who ignored warning signs. They were not the ones who pushed forward without asking harder questions. They had trusted professionals to do their jobs correctly. Outside, the courthouse cameras flashed as reporters rushed to file stories. Questions echoed from every direction. Yet the moment that stayed with me happened several days later. I returned to the subdivision for the first time since the ruling. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. The houses still stood. Lawns were freshly mowed. Mailboxes lined the streets. Children played in front yards. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that familiar appearance, everything had. The certainty was gone. The illusion of unquestioned control had disappeared. People were finally asking the questions that should have been asked years earlier. I parked near the community park and walked toward the oak tree. Warm sunlight filtered through the branches overhead. Birds moved between the leaves. The rough bark felt exactly the same beneath my hand as it had when my grandfather stood there decades ago. Around me, life continued. Neighbors talked while walking dogs. A maintenance crew trimmed shrubs nearby. Wind moved softly through the grass. Standing there, I thought about how strange the entire journey had been. Millions of dollars. Years of planning. Hundreds of meetings. Endless paperwork. Yet the truth had remained anchored to something simple. A tree. A survey. A family record preserved inside an old steel lockbox. My grandfather understood something many people forget. Time rewards patience. Facts outlast confidence. Reality does not care how powerful someone feels. It does not care how many people agree with a mistake. Eventually, the truth reaches the surface. Margaret resigned from her position not long afterward. New leadership took over community operations. Financial disputes continued for months. Legal teams worked through complex issues. Experts reviewed records. Solutions were negotiated. The process was not dramatic. It was methodical, just like the evidence that started everything. One evening near sunset, I stood beneath the oak tree one final time. Golden light stretched across the neighborhood. The leaves rustled overhead with the same sound I remembered from childhood. For a moment, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again. If anybody ever tells you this land belongs to somebody else, start there. I smiled and looked up through the branches. He had been right all along. The answer had never been hidden. People simply stopped paying attention. And that is the thing about justice. It does not need to be loud. It does not need to arrive quickly. It only needs the truth, enough patience to protect it, and enough courage to finally bring it into the light.